I never imagined that grief would make people reveal their true faces. But the moment my father's money entered the room, love turned into strategy, kindness turned into calculation, and the woman who once hugged me at family dinners became the one who tried to erase me in front of everyone. My name is Morgan, and the first thing I remember after my father died was Vanessa squeezing my hands at the funeral and saying, "We'll take care of everything," in a voice so calm it felt rehearsed, as if grief had already been scheduled between meetings. I said, "I don't know how to do this without him," and she smiled at me and replied, "You won't have to, trust me," while Daniel stood beside her staring at the floor like he was waiting for instructions. At the reception hall I heard whispers that stopped when I walked closer, and I asked, did I miss something? But Vanessa laughed softly and said, "Just boring paperwork talk." Even though I had clearly heard the words trust and shares hanging in the air like smoke. I told Daniel, "I feel like everyone is speaking a language I don't understand," and he answered, "You're exhausted, Morgan," without looking at me, which hurt more than if he had argued later. While folding programs alone, I heard Vanessa say to someone, "Robert planned everything carefully," and another voice replied, "So Morgan won't have control," and when I stepped forward, Vanessa quickly said, "Sweetheart, you should be resting," like my presence was a problem that needed managing. I asked her quietly, "What did you mean by control?" And she tilted her head and said, "Money makes people emotional, and I'm just protecting the family." That night at my childhood home, Daniel said, "Vanessa thinks it's better if she handles the financial stuff," and I replied, "Did my father say that?" And Daniel hesitated before saying, he trusted her judgment, which felt like a door closing. I told him, "I trusted you," and he whispered, "This isn't personal." Even though everything about it felt personal. The next morning, Vanessa called and said, "I've set meetings with the advisor," and I asked, "Shouldn't I be there?" And she answered, "You're grieving, Morgan. Let us carry this," with a tone that sounded generous but final. I said, "I want to understand what Dad wanted," and she replied, "Understanding can wait." Which was when I realized my grief was being used against me. At lunch with relatives, someone asked Vanessa, "How is Morgan handling everything?" And before I could speak she said, "She's fragile right now," and I forced a smile and said, "I'm right here," while my hands shook under the table. Daniel finally looked at me and said nothing, and that silence told me exactly where I stood. When I confronted Vanessa in the kitchen, I said, "Please stop speaking for me." And she leaned closer and whispered, "I'm keeping you safe." And I answered, "From what?" But she just smiled again. As I went to bed that night, I realized love had quietly turned into strategy, and I fell asleep knowing the family I believed in was already negotiating my place without me. Before the will was even mentioned directly, Vanessa said, "Your father hated conflict," and I replied, "He hated dishonesty more," which made her pause just long enough to show me I had touched something real. Daniel cleared his throat and said, "Can we not do this now?" And I answered, "If not now, when?" Because my voice was shaking but still mine. Vanessa sighed and said, "This is why we worry about you." And I asked, "Because I ask questions," and she replied, "Because emotions cloud judgment." While everyone watched me like I was proving her point. Later that afternoon, I sat with my Aunt Karen, and she whispered, "Your dad always meant for you to be strong." And I said, "Then why does everyone keep telling me to sit down?" And she squeezed my hand and said, "Because strong women scare people." When Vanessa walked in and said, "We're just trying to protect you," I looked at her and said, "Then stop treating me like a liability," and the room went silent, heavy, and uncomfortable. That silence followed me into the hallway, where Daniel said, "Please don't make this harder," and I asked, "Harder for who?" and he didn't answer, which felt like the final confirmation I was on my own. Vanessa passed by and said, "Get some rest," and I replied, "I will after I learn the truth." And she stopped walking for the first time. As I watched her walk away, I finally understood that grief had made me quiet, but greed had made them careless, and I promised myself that whatever came next, I would not disappear politely, because my father's love had taught me better than that. This was only the beginning of everything falling apart. Vanessa invited me to her office and said, "I want everyone to see we're united." and I believed her because I still wanted to believe she meant family when she said it. The lobby smelled like coffee and confidence, and she whispered, "Stay close," like guidance, not control. In the meeting room, she said, "This is my sister-in-law Morgan." And before I finished saying hello, she added, "She's been very emotional since our loss," and the word emotional landed harder than grief. I said, "I'm managing," but she laughed lightly and replied, "That's what strength looks like, right?" Well, everyone smiled politely. When the finance director asked me, "Do you understand the structure?" I answered, "My father explained some of it," and Vanessa interrupted with, "He protected her from stress," as if my childhood needed footnotes. I felt heat in my face and said, "I asked questions, and she answered, 'You always did,' turning curiosity into a flaw. At lunch, a woman named Melissa said, "You're brave for being here," and Vanessa responded, "She needs structure." Before I could speak, I finally said, "I don't need managing," and Vanessa replied, "We all do after trauma," and I wondered when grief became a diagnosis. During another meeting, I said that's not what my father intended, and Vanessa corrected me and said, "Intentions change with reality." And the room nodded like agreement had been decided already. I stayed quiet after that, listening as she explained my life without me. Ryan asked, "Will Morgan be involved long term?" And Vanessa said, "We're easing her out of pressure." And I realized she was rehearsing my disappearance. I said, "I can speak for myself," and she smiled and answered, "Of course you can," without giving me space. In the elevator, I asked, "Why do you keep doing that?" And she said, "Protecting you." And I replied, "By making me look weak." And she answered, "By keeping you safe." Like weakness and safety were the same. That night, I cried alone and whispered, "Stop letting her erase you." And I understood that silence was becoming consent, and staying quiet was costing me more than confrontation ever could. The next morning I returned because leaving felt like surrender, and Vanessa said, "You're being brave again," and I answered, "I'm being present," even though my voice shook. Melissa asked, "Do you want coffee?" And Vanessa answered, "She shouldn't have caffeine." And I said, "I can decide." And the room shifted slightly. During a presentation I said, I reviewed the numbers, and Vanessa smiled tightly and said she likes to stay busy. And Ryan asked, "Are you comfortable?" And I replied, "I am learning," which felt like rebellion. Vanessa leaned close and whispered, "Don't make this awkward," and I whispered back, "You already did." When the meeting ended, Ryan said, "You handled that well," and Vanessa laughed and said, "She's improving," and something inside me cracked because I was not a project. I looked at her and said, "Stop narrating me." And she replied, "I'm helping," and I answered, "You're controlling." In the hallway she said, "People trust me," and I replied, "They don't know me," and she said, "Exactly," like it was victory. I stood there shaking and realized she was not slipping, she was rewriting, and if I stayed silent, the story would end without my voice. I called Daniel and said, "She's doing it again." And he replied, "You're sensitive," and I said, "I'm aware," and he said, "Just let her lead." And that hurt more than her words. I told him, "I feel erased," and he said, "You're overthinking," and I ended the call shaking. Back inside, Vanessa said, "Everything okay?" And I answered, "No," and she said, "See to no one." And I realized she was waiting for me to break. I didn't, but I promised myself I would not stay small forever. As I left, Melissa whispered, "You're stronger than she says," and I whispered back, "I know," for the first time. And that single truth followed me home, louder than her voice, steadier than fear, and impossible to unlearn. I sat in my car and said, "You exist." And I cried until my chest hurt, because being seen by myself felt like survival starting. Slow and terrifying, but real. I drove home knowing tomorrow would be harder, but silence was no longer an option, and that knowledge changed everything inside me. This was the day I learned public smiles could destroy quietly, and I refused to disappear again. I breathed deeply and chose myself. For the first time, that decision saved me, even before I knew it. I sat alone in my father's study and said out loud, "I don't know who I am without you." And the silence answered me honestly in a way no person had dared to. I opened his old letters and whispered, you always believed in me, and reading his handwriting felt like being reminded of myself. Before I learned to apologize for existing, I called Daniel and said, "We need to talk." And he answered, "Make it quick," which already told me how little space I occupied in his life now. When he arrived, I said, "Why did you let her speak for me?" And he replied, "She's better at handling things, like love was a skill set I failed to learn." I said, "She's erasing me," and he answered, "You're being dramatic." And I asked, "Do you even hear me?" And he said, "I hear problems, not pain, not grief, not his sister." I told him, "Dad trusted me," and he replied, "Dad is gone," which felt like betrayal wrapped in logic. I asked, "Did you read the will?" And he said, "Vanessa explained it," and I answered, "That's not what I asked." And he sighed and said, "Why are you making this difficult?" And I realized I had been begging someone who was already gone. I said, "I won't stay quiet anymore." And he replied, "You'll regret stirring things up." And I answered, "I already regret staying silent." And he looked at me like I was a stranger. When he left, I said to the empty room, "I choose myself," and my hands shook while saying it. That night I spoke to my father's letters and said, "They think I'm weak." And I imagined him answering, "You were never meant to be small." And that memory held me together when I almost folded. I told myself, "Stop asking permission," and cried until my chest loosened. The next day I met Claire and said, "I feel stupid for not knowing," and she replied, "You were grieving," and I said, "They use that," and she answered, "Then we correct it." She explained facts calmly, and I realized clarity felt like oxygen after being underwater too long. I said, "So I wasn't excluded," and she replied, "Not legally," and something steady grew inside me. I asked, "Why did they act like I had no say?" And she answered, "Control thrives on confusion." And suddenly everything made sense. When Daniel called and said, "What are you doing?" I replied, "Learning," and he said, "Vanessa is upset," and I answered, "I'm done managing her feelings." He said, "This is tearing us apart." And I replied, "It already did." I stopped explaining myself and started listening carefully. Because silence was no longer surrender, it was strategy. I said to myself, "You don't need approval." And that sentence changed how my body felt in rooms where I once shrank. Vanessa texted, "We need to talk," and I replied, "When I'm ready," and she answered, "You're acting irrational," and I said, "I'm acting informed," and put the phone down while shaking. I walked past my reflection and said, "You don't belong to them," and the fear didn't disappear, but it stopped leading. I realized loneliness was quieter than humiliation, and peace was better than belonging built on obedience. When I sat alone again, I said, "I will be misunderstood," and I answered myself, "And still be free," and that truth felt heavy. And right in my chest, I stopped rehearsing explanations and started planning boundaries. I whispered Dad would be proud, and for the first time since he died, I believed it without needing agreement. The need to be chosen faded, replaced by the strength to choose myself without apology. That was the night I stopped begging to belong and started standing where I was meant to stand. Even if I stood alone, especially then, I walked into Vanessa's office for the last time knowing I was not there to defend myself anymore, but to listen. She said, "You look confident today," and I replied, "I finally understand what's mine," which made her blink. Ryan cleared his throat and said, "We need clarification about the audit," and Vanessa laughed and said, "This is unnecessary," but her voice shook. I said, "You told them I couldn't handle numbers," and she snapped, "You're emotional," and I answered, "Facts don't cry." Melissa looked at me and said, "Is that true?" And I replied, "Ask the documents." While Vanessa stared at the table, Daniel rushed in and said, "What's happening?" And I looked at him and said, "The truth finally arrived." Vanessa said, "You planned this," and I answered, "I planned my silence to end." Ryan said, "There are inconsistencies," and Vanessa said, "Morgan misunderstood," and I replied, "I understood perfectly." The room felt heavy as Melissa said, "You told us she wasn't involved," and Vanessa whispered, "I was protecting her." I said, "You were protecting control," and she finally looked at me with fear instead of confidence. Daniel said, "Why didn't you tell me?" and I replied, "You never listened." Vanessa raised her voice and said, "You're doing this to hurt me," and I answered calmly, I'm doing this to stop hurting, Ryan said. We need transparency. And Vanessa said, this is betrayal, and I replied, this is accountability. Melissa whispered, I'm sorry, and I said, I don't need apologies anymore. Vanessa looked around and said, you all trusted me, and I replied, trust survives truth. Daniel stepped closer and said, we're family. And I said, family doesn't erase you. Vanessa said, you think you won, and I answered, I think I'm free. The meeting ended quietly, and no one followed her when she left. Outside, Daniel said, I didn't know how bad it was, and I replied, not knowing was comfortable. He said, can we fix this? And I answered, I already fixed myself. When Vanessa passed me, she said, you ruined everything, and I replied, you built it on lies. I walked away while she stood still, finally small without needing me to shrink. In my car I said, Dad, I didn't fight dirty, and I imagined him saying, you fought honest. I realized karma did not need my anger, only my presence, and the truth spoken clearly. That night Daniel texted, I'm sorry, and I replied, take care of yourself. Vanessa never apologized, but silence followed her everywhere she went. I slept peacefully knowing exposure had done what revenge never could. Weeks later Melissa said, you seem lighter, and I answered, I stopped carrying lies. I closed my father's letters and said, I kept myself, and that felt like victory. I understood then that losing my father taught me how not to lose myself again. I said, my worth doesn't need witnesses, and the word stayed. I chose peace over proof, distance over drama, and dignity over revenge. I no longer explained, defended, or begged to be seen. I existed fully, quietly, and without permission. This was the ending I needed. Even if it wasn't loud. I walked forward knowing my life finally belonged to me. I remembered every moment I stayed silent and forgave myself for surviving the only way I knew how. I said, you did the best you could, and that kindness healed something deep. The world did not clap, but my chest felt steady and strong. I met Claire later and said, it's over. And she smiled and said, it's begun. I laughed softly and said, I finally believe that, without fear. When I passed Vanessa's office days later, her door was closed. No whispers followed me anymore, and no one corrected my voice. I spoke when I wanted, and silence belonged to me again. I stopped replaying conversations and started building new ones. I told myself, you survived betrayal without becoming bitter, and I held onto that truth. The money no longer scared me because control was gone. I learned grief could coexist with strength without destroying either. I said, I am enough, until it felt natural. Daniel stopped calling, and I let that be its own answer. I forgave him quietly without reopening the door. I forgave myself loudly in the privacy of my heart. That forgiveness felt like breathing after years underwater. I understood justice did not require my suffering to be loud. It required my refusal to disappear. I looked ahead and said, I choose peace every time, and meant it. The future felt unknown but finally honest. I carried my father's lessons forward instead of his loss. I stood taller without trying. I smiled without asking permission. I lived without shrinking. That was my karma. That was my freedom. That was my life returning to me. I closed this chapter with gratitude instead of rage. I walked on without looking back. I was finally whole. I promised myself to protect this peace fiercely, gently, and forever, because surviving taught me how precious a quiet, honest life truly is for the woman I became.